Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the foreign policy community of Indonesia for hosting us. I would like to start by introducing our impressive panel today. We have Jim Lee Chun, the president of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIB. And we have Ahmed Saeed, the vice president of the Asian Development Bank, ADB. We have Rick Sammons, the director of research of the International Labor Organization, the ILO. And then we have Takatoshi Ito, professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. Well, let's start with Ahmed. So let's start with a question with you. Is Asia out of the woods? What are the prospects for Asia's recoveries, and what are the lessons can the world learn from Asia?
Thank you very much. Could I speak first?
Oh, you can. Sorry, I didn't know you were here. Sorry. I'm so glad you're here. So please do. You first.
Thank you very much. I would like to share with you my thoughts on the main topic tonight. But first of all, I'd like to say I feel very much privileged to join the panelists and to discuss some of the most important challenges faced by Asia and the rest of the world. I think we should understand that the global economic downturn and also the Asian's economic downturn is not part of the normal business cycle. This is due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And just because of the impact of pandemic, because of the social distancing, the banning on travel, and a lot of disruptions to the global production chain, any traditional measures, any stimulus package would not make a big difference. I think this is something which we should keep in mind. Now, what should we do? First of all, I think each and every government in Asia and the rest of the world should try their very best to contain the COVID-19 pandemic, to stop the contagion of this virus. At the same time, I think speeding up the research and the production of safe and effective vaccine is vitally important for the recovery of the businesses. Only when we have available safe and effective vaccine could it be possible for our life and business to be back in normal. So the point is, this is not just a normal business cycle, and it calls for international concerted efforts to work together to deal with the pandemic on two fronts. One is try to speed up the efforts for production of safe and effective vaccine. The other is try to contain the spread of the virus in each and every country. And then we will be able to see what should be done to recover the economy. Thank you. Let me stop here.
Yeah. Thank you, President Jean. This is Dino Jalal. Wonderful to have you here with us. And it's great to see the great work that you're doing. The AIIB has set aside $13 billion to aid members' recovery from COVID-19. Can you talk about how you're working with your member countries to help them on the road to recovery? How do we rebuild from this? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I will be very pleased to share with you information about what the bank has been doing since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you know, the bank's mandate is to promote investment in infrastructure and other productive sectors for the purpose of promoting economic and social development in its member countries. And we do not have the policy lending instruments. We don't have budget support kind of financing, as probably ADB and the World Bank do. However, given the very special circumstances, it is important for us to shift a little bit from the traditional infrastructure to the budget support and policy lending, including supporting the healthcare. So in this regard, with the support of the board, we set up a COVID-19 crisis recovery facility in an amount of $13 billion. Actually, it started with $500 million, then we increased to $1 billion and the $13 billion. And for the policy lending, we co-finance with the World Bank and ADB, taking advantage of the skills, the macroeconomic research. We can better target these resources to help these countries. So this demonstrates that our bank is very agile, adaptive, and would be responsive to the member countries. So I'm very much grateful to the World Bank, to ADB, and other institutions for their support. So our concerted efforts have really made a difference. Let me stop here.
Thank you. Laura?
Thank you, Mr. Jin. So I think now we can go to Ahmed. Ahmed, can you talk about Asian recovery and what can the world learn from Asia?
I think I would be pretty optimistic about the Asian recovery led by China. China has been very effective in containing the virus, and as you see, China could achieve positive growth rates in this year. This is a very good news for the rest of Asia, particularly for the trading partners of China. And as you see, the Asian countries, the governments are working very hard, and they have some effective measures. So I'm confident that probably in 6 months' time, by the end of the second quarter, many Asian countries will probably walk out of the pandemic crisis, and particularly if we could have the vaccine by that time. Now, I remember in 1997 and 1998, when the some of the Eastern Asian countries were hit by the financial crisis, and some predictors said, well, for the next 10 years, this would be very dark period for all those countries. It took just 3 or 4 years' time for Asian countries to recover. So the Asian countries are resilient. I think they are very much determined and committed. And also you can see the very good cooperation between the government and the people in dealing with the pandemic. In the case of China, you see, I have been here all of the time since the outbreak of the pandemic. Certainly, government took some measures to contain it. But you see, the cooperation by the people has been vital. So much so that you never know whether it's the government's decree, government's rules, or the people's initiative. So it's one and the same kind of thing. So if the government and people can cooperate to contain the virus, it would probably achieve faster results. Likewise, if the government and people, including private sector and the public sector working together, I think we can also speed up the recovery of the economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those insights. So let's get the view from the Asian Development Bank as well. So Ahmed, if you can share your views.
Yeah, well, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Dr. Jalal. Obviously, thank you to the fellow panelists. It's an honor to be part of this forum, and amazing to hear we have so many countries and so many people. On the question of what are the lessons from this crisis, I think the developing countries of the world, over the last several decades, have been looking at Asian countries and looking to them for lessons. And I think the first lesson of the crisis for me is that this role of Asia as a leader in setting the global agenda in development and in other areas is increasingly important, and even more so than it was before the crisis. Now, turning from that to other lessons I think that have been learned, I think it's very, very clear, and I think this is a lesson that many countries in Asia were in a position to demonstrate, is that it's just fundamentally important to keep your fiscal and economic house in order for a rainy day. Countries in this part of the world have had more space to operate. They've been able to move more quickly. They've been able to move with less concern for creating long-term issues simply because their balance sheets were in order because they had been investing in public sector capacity and capabilities for some time. I think the second really important lesson to learn is learn your lessons from the last crisis. And I think the single thing that distinguishes countries that have had relative success from those that have had relative failure in the face of this crisis is that those who've had relative success almost invariably had to deal with similar things in the past. SARS, MERS, places like Singapore, places like South Korea, all learned the lessons from that crisis. And so I think that leads naturally to the next lesson, and this is a lesson they learned, which is the importance of strong, decisive, quick action when dealing with crises like this. So certainly in terms of containment, Vietnam, for example, was very successful with very early border shutdowns in terms of the use of testing, tracing, isolation, and also in terms of building up testing and treatment capacity before a crisis. I think another lesson that's very, very clear is the need for policy support, and in particular for directed policy support for the most needy. East Asian countries have provided close to 17% of GDP in terms of fiscal response to this crisis, the bulk of that in terms of income support. And so I do think that one of the lessons of the crisis is the absolute importance and centrality of moving quickly and in scale to help those most in need. I'll just mention a couple other lessons, although I think as with so many of these sorts of events that upend our world, we will be learning the lessons of this for some time. And the two final lessons I'll point to are really on the economic side. The first immediate and the second a bit more long-term. The immediate lesson on the economic side is that you want to have flexible capacity within your economy. There are countries in the region that were able to rapidly reorient to supply and demand products, and that allowed some amount of domestic economic activity to resume, but it also allowed them to benefit for the sharp increase in supply. In terms of long-term, I point to two things, one specific and one more of a policy observation. Long-term, it's clearly become even more important that countries develop in digital capacity for many, many reasons, not just in terms of growth, but in terms of their ability to deliver support to their people. And then I think the question we're going to be grappling over for some time as we move forward is what lessons has this crisis taught us about the relationship between the public sector and the private sector? And we have for some time been on a trajectory where both had sort of been converging around a new mean, with increasing recognition in some quarters that the state has some role to play, although there are always risks. But also we've seen enormous moves in the private sector towards things like impact investing and standards to recognize that they too have an obligation to have a double bottom line. And I think that these trends and the new dynamic that emerges in terms of cooperation and even more than cooperation, collaboration towards common purpose between the public and private sectors is going to be one of the really important lessons and insights that we need to gain from this crisis. Thank you.
Yeah. Pak Said, what do you think the regional economy will look like after COVID-19, and what do you think are the opportunities for transformations emerging from this crisis?
Well, I think the first thing that I would say is, and it's a sad but unfortunate and true fact, we are in and will be in a world that is much poorer than it was before, at least in the immediate future. And that's true in terms of wealth destruction. That's true in terms of disproportionate harm on those who are most vulnerable. And it's also true, and this may be the most significant of the three, it's also true in that we are in the midst of a destruction of productive capacity. And we're in the midst of a destruction of small, medium-sized organizations that embed within their software and their DNA the potential to generate productivity growth and to generate growth going forward. And so I think that as we look forward and we talk about the opportunities, we first have to sort of base set. Now, I would say also, I think President Jin made a very, very good point, which is this crisis is not part of the normal business cycle. And I think for that reason, and also because of some of the inherent robustness of of both economies and the public sector in Asia, it's not inappropriate to think that a very strong bounce back at some point will be possible. Now, what are the specific areas of opportunity? I think we'll see them as they emerge, but clearly digital economy is something that people have recognized as an area of opportunity for some time, and I think will be an even greater area of opportunity. I think that as we move forward, countries will begin to recognize that having an energy mix that is sustainable and green is actually a competitive advantage in the competition for FDI and in the competition for development progress. And so I think a greater push on sustainable infrastructure and on having climate-friendly sources of energy generation will grow. I think countries with young and growing populations will continue to benefit from rising levels of consumption, from leisure and travel. I think these will come back after a period of time, and from other sectors that are driven by these demographic trends, including financial services and healthcare. And I think there will also continue to be a push in the region, both towards greater domestic-driven growth and consumer-driven growth, and also some ability to potentially benefit from a reorientation of supply chains. So I think that there will be plenty of opportunity on the other side of this. We're going to have to make up for lost ground, and we're going to have to build from there. But I do think the countries of the region are well positioned for that exercise.
And now I would like to shift gears and call on Rick Sammons from the International Labor Organization. Rick, I would like to hear your views on the future of jobs, from retraining to reskilling to automation, remote working. What do you think of the long-term effects of COVID-19 on the global workforce?
Okay, thanks.
Has he frozen? Rick, we can't hear you.
All right, looks like I dropped off.
Okay, you're back. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, folks. Great timing there. So, one thing to observe is that the future of work isn't what it used to be, even as recently as a year ago or so. This particular shock to the economy, which my colleagues have been discussing, has had quite a significant impact. We've done some global estimations, and at the nadir, at the depth of the health crisis, at least the first wave of it, back in the spring and summer, we estimated that working hour losses around the globe represented about 17.3% below the labor activity that was occurring at the end of 2019. That translates into about 500 million full-time equivalent jobs. And that in turn translates into about 11% drop in labor income. So there has been some clawing back of those losses in both employment and underemployment on the one hand and labor income on the other. But it is fair to say that these effects will be lingering in some quite significant respects. Now, beyond that, it is true, as we've been discussing so far today, that significant parts of Asia are decoupling in a positive way from the trajectory that much of the rest of the world is experiencing, including in the Americas, Africa, and Europe, where we're witnessing still very, very challenging circumstances and indeed a second wave. So, we're going to be contending with a recovery for quite some time. And the real issue here, it seems to us, is the extent to which this recovery is going to be human-centered in a corresponding way to which the effects of the crisis were very human-centered. This crisis had a very direct effect on people, on their livelihoods, on their basic level of human security, and the like. So I let me just simply stop here because I'm not sure how well we're doing technically. I would say that what is necessary going forward is to think through not solely the macro, more top-down responses, as important as they are, although let me open a parenthesis here, about nearly 9/10 of the global fiscal response to the pandemic crisis has been in advanced countries. And about 3% of the value of that fiscal stimulus has actually been in a very large number of lower middle income and low income countries. So the challenge for us, as I was saying, is not only to think about the broader instruments, the macro economic policy stimulus instruments that are available, but it's also to think at a household level. What are ways that more directly and from the bottom up can address the very human dimensions of this crisis? That is to say, areas of job-rich or employment-intensive investment, ways to extend worker rights and protections. I know there have been some very important extensions of those protections and during the crisis, but one important question is what we learned from that, and are we able to then extend it going forward, given how, indeed, the future of work, how the number of forces that are driving further dislocation and insecurity on the part of workers. And this extends also to social insurance systems going forward, and indeed invest in the capabilities of people. Those four elements of investment in people, in the view of the ILO, are really what's going to determine the extent to which this recovery not only shows up in broad GDP numbers, but also shows up at a human scale. And that, at the end of the day, is the bottom line way societies measure the performance of their economies, not through GDP, of course, as has been discussed so much in the past decade or so, but in how their living standards fare. So let me pause there.
Okay. Richard, a lot of economies are going to experience jobs crisis, including in Indonesia. We have about 12 million people unemployed at the moment. How do we put the millions of unemployed workers back to work?
So this requires some really specific thinking about what are some of the most employment-intensive areas of our economies, and particularly those areas that have some positive social externalities, as economists would say. And there are some, and I think one or two were mentioned earlier in the discussion. Let's take sustainable infrastructure, known to be employment-intensive as investment goes, and there's a resounding degree of consensus that we ought to be retrofitting a dirty old or insufficient such infrastructure, as well as building greenfield new, more efficient infrastructure that both, makes for greater resource productivity on the one hand, and a more livable planet on the other. But the challenge is not the policy direction. There seems to be quite a bit of agreement about that policy direction. The challenge is the resourcing. And to be candid, the international financial community, both on the public and private sector sides, have not managed to crack this problem. We have, north of $120 trillion of investable assets in institutional investment firms of various sorts, or sovereign wealth funds around the world. And yet only a very small proportion of that goes into infrastructure, and an even tinier proportion of that goes into developing country infrastructure. Meanwhile, a very significant proportion of those portfolios is now invested in either negative earning assets or assets that earn less than 1%, whereas infrastructure assets have been reliably yielding for years low double-digit returns. And by the way, the loss profiles in African infrastructure are no different, indeed a little bit better than some of the northern markets. So there's no other way to state it than to suggest that we have a misallocation of capital that isn't just a financial sector issue. It's not just a financial efficiency issue. The failure to address this misallocation of capital is creating an enormous employment opportunity cost, an opportunity cost for job creation. And particularly now after this massive hit to our labor markets, this is an area where the international community has to focus and act to a much greater extent. And so if you, the answer to your question is, this is one area, but there are a couple of others that could be discussed where we have to not just look at labor policy, employment policy, we really need to look at both the public and private resourcing dimensions of the issue if we really want to make more rapid progress.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you. So now I'd like to take the conversation to North Asia and ask Professor Ito-san to talk to us about Japan. And Japan's the world's third largest economy. They have a new prime minister now, Suga-san. Professor Ito, you said that if the vaccine, when it comes out, Japan will lead Japan into a U-shaped recovery, economic recovery. What are you saying now about Japan's economy and prospects?
So Japan, US, to some extent Europe share the similar nature of similar impact of this COVID crisis. And for the shape of the recovery, I would say it is a K-shaped recovery. So it is sector. There are sectors which are doing fine in remote working, and all the finance people are still working from home office. Professors are teaching from home office, and that's going basically normally. And most suffering is on the small and medium-sized enterprises and the services sector, airlines and hotels. So there are differential impacts on different sectors. And it's all same in Japan and the US and Europe. All the airline industry, all the airline companies are suffering tremendously. But the electronics and computers and delivery businesses are doing fine. Logistics doing fine. So we have to recognize this is sort of a very interesting impact. It's like natural disaster on the particular sectors of the economy. It is very different from global financial crisis, where financial sectors started the disaster and spread to the real sector. This natural disaster like COVID attacked on the real sector first. So one lesson from here is that we need to contain the crisis in the real sector and to keep the financial sector going by remote working. And if this spreads to the financial sector by non-performing loans and so on, then crisis will get prolonged tremendously. So we need to realize that this differential impacts on the different sectors and make the policies accordingly. And this is a challenge. So we need to help the most affected sectors domestically by governments, each government, and international coordination is needed for the countries which suffer disproportionately, like countries rely on tourism, and the country relies on those supply chains from other countries. So we need a concerted effort to help the countries which suffer most, and which could be additional financing or the debt reductions by all the members, all the lenders across the board, and that is one important policy directions that we should be discussing. And Japan, US, and Europe are now seeing this K-shaped recovery. And the important question is what will happen when we get vaccines and treatment, established treatment. Are we going back to an old normal, or are we heading to the new normal, right? So if the K-shape is continues to like that, then we need to realize that new normal will happen, and we need a different kind of industries, different kind of companies, and technologies which support the shift from the industries and sectors which we may not need anymore in 10 years, and shift to the new normal, new industries. And Ahmed mentioned very important things like we need green recovery, and we need to have those infrastructure which is targeted to the new industries. And that is something we should be thinking, and I think international organizations like ADB and AIIB should be thinking. So to help the bottom, most suffering people in industries, that's one. Two, that we should prepare for the new normal and new kind of lifestyles and industries. Thank you.
Those are very good points, and I would like to follow up on the last points and call back on President Jin. President Jin, you mentioned that investing in health systems are critical. What is the AIIB doing to encourage more infrastructure investment relating to public health systems?
I think one of the lessons of the pandemic is that there must be balanced investment and development between physical infrastructure and social infrastructure, including healthcare. As you know, pandemic has caused major disruptions in the global economic chain, and the service sector was the worst hit. The airlines and trains, all this kind of service sectors, transportation were seriously impacted on. So if you build up a lot of assets in physical infrastructure, but to the neglect of healthcare, it will be a big problem. So learning from this lesson, our bank would like to pay proper attention to the health sector moving forward. We believe a balanced approach would make the development more effective and productive. On the other hand, I think we also should understand that education is very much important. What I refer to is not the general education, but the vocational education, which can help the younger generation fit into the AI era, in the era where high tech and the non-traditional kind of industry will require of the skills of the people. For instance, I think it's quite ironic in today's world when we are all enjoying the fruits of high tech, this e-commerce and robots, all these kind of things. On the other hand, it took so long for all of these countries to produce safe and effective vaccine. What does this tell us? This tells us there are weakest links in the global economy. So I think emerging from the pandemic, a lot of countries would have to reconsider their development paradigm. It is important for these economies to to be resilient, but you cannot be resilient without thinking about the modern education and healthcare. So we would like to adjust our focus just a little bit, while we will remain focused on physical infrastructure. We would like to allocate a certain amount of resources to help the developing countries to improve their healthcare sector and also education. So I think this is probably the lesson we should learn from the pandemic. And also I want to highlight the point that people should not draw lessons or draw wrong lessons from the pandemic. They should draw right lessons. What I mean by wrong lessons is, since the disruption happened, causing economic troubles to so many countries, people say, hey, from now on, why should we be integrated into the global economy? Why not just stay within our border to turn inward? And that is the wrong lesson. The pandemic certainly has momentarily caused disruptions so that social distancing is enforced. But the way out is not to segregate all these economies from each other. Rather, we should work towards a better integrated economy through some of the measures which can, for instance, help these countries to provide healthcare service and to produce safe and effective vaccines or other kind of, medical treatment so that people can go back to normal. So I think it's very much important to draw correct lessons rather than the thinking we should all stay away from each other. If that happens, that's really the recipe for disaster.
Totally agree with you. Laura, please.
Yeah, President Chen, I'd like to stay with you and have another question. COVID is, making a lot of companies and organizations like yours reset your policies and rethink about the future. I know that recently you have pledged a no coal investment. So I was wondering if you can talk about your ESG and sustainability and AIB's evolving approach to those things. And then after, I would like Ahmed to also talk about that from the ADB perspective.
I said on some occasions that we need also to look at the cryptic association or relationship, or even mystic association relationship between climate change, drastic weather, and the virus, bacteria. Now, we say the COVID-19 is a natural disaster. That's true. But by definition, natural disaster occurs naturally. On the other hand, we understand that drastic weather, climate change would be the breeding ground for bacteria, for pandemics. So what prima facie looks like natural is not so innocent. So I believe we should pay more attention to the protection of the environment, ecosystem. Any disorder of the ecosystem would lead to some unfortunate occurrences of the health hazards. Of course, there's no hard evidence suggesting that this COVID-19 definitely has certain kind of relationship with some of the climate change or something of that kind. But I do believe, given my 40 years experience traveling to poor areas of the low-income countries, when I saw the terrible living conditions, the slums, I have no difficulty understanding why bubonic plague, cholera, malaria, hydrophobia are endemic to those areas. So we should understand this and try our very best to deal with climate change. On the other hand, a number of countries, you see, still depend very much on coal. And this certainly lead to greenhouse gas emissions. And also, I think the health hazard of burning lots of coal is a big problem. So you see, even though you think the coal burning power plants electricity is cheaper, but you should look at the other end, increasing medical bills, medical costs to these people. So if you take on a macro a perspective of the economy, looking at all these different aspects of development, you should have no difficult understanding that support the renewable energy to reduce the burning or eliminate the coal firing power plants would be really important for the country's economies and for the people. So I think there are lots of things we can think about emerging from the crisis. Let me stop here.
No, thank you for that. Ahmed, do you want to talk from the ADB perspective?
Yeah, sure. I think, Laura, I think that this question that you've asked, it's a really, really important question, which is the role of ESG, the role of the private sector and others in mobilizing to solve these problems. And I think if we back up and we ask ourselves, why do we find ourselves where we are? Whether that question is applied to the political landscape and increasing polarization and the decreasing legitimacy of political institutions in certain contexts, or that whether we ask ourselves that question about the private sector and the willingness of companies to do things that impose externalities on others. You know, across every element of society, I think we, over the last several decades, have moved into a world where people did not internalize these externalities, formally or informally. And I think so many of our problems in the world today can be traced to this root cause. And I think one of the most important pivots we have to make as we move forward in every arena is to all become people who focus on paying it forward, as opposed to simply being the beneficiaries of good acts from the past that we benefit from in an accrued sense. Now, what does that mean for ADB? Well, our work is development, and there's an important set of ideas in development theory that says that the legitimacy and capability of institutions is central to the development project. And I would remind people that in many of the countries where we operate, it's not just political institutions, it is also economic institutions that need to have legitimacy and that have a role to play in solving problems. We saw this in a very, very powerful way during COVID across Asia. Here in the Philippines, we had an unprecedented partnership between the government of the Philippines, the ADB, and the private sector. We delivered millions of meals. We increased the testing capacity of the country from 3,000 PCR tests a day to 30,000 in a matter of weeks. And we did a whole host of other things as a group, leveraging fully our capabilities, with everybody recognizing that the responsibilities were not narrowly defined to one subset of their stakeholders. Now, the other thing that I'd say that's very important is there is a tidal wave of interest in the private sector that is growing to change how they do business, whether that's the statement in the United States from the 50 largest CEOs and the Business Roundtable, but everywhere else. And Rick raised a really important question. He said there's trillions of dollars of assets, and he made a very interesting point. The risk is lower in Africa than in Europe. Why isn't this money moving? One thing that's very clear is that failure to move is not a failure of intent or desire. And I'd remind people, it's a very old phrase, but I first heard it from Robert Rubin in the context of the Asian financial crisis. Capital is a coward. And so the number one reason why capital doesn't move is not because of opportunities not being large enough. It's because of risks. And those risks are either misunderstood or they are actually higher. The other reason why capital hasn't moved is because we need better measurements. And there have been efforts to start to develop impact indices. The green bond market, which is now $1 billion in scale, is a great example of a subsector where improved methodologies actually created improved outcomes. And then the other reason why it doesn't move, and I think this is an extraordinarily important one, is scale. I'm at the ADB now, but in prior lives, I've been both in government and I've been in the private sector. And when I was in the private sector, I worked with a number of the largest investors in the world who were actually very eager to invest in frontier markets. And the issues they confronted more often than not were questions of scale. how do I deploy enough money into this asset class or geography for it actually to be worth the cost? And I think I mentioned this because I think some of these issues that I've mentioned to you that are impeding the ability of companies and others to realize their ESG ambitions are the sorts of problems that multilaterals like the ADB and the AIIB are uniquely positioned to solve. Because actually these typically reflect collective action problems. They reflect problems of creating standards. And our institutions have legitimacy, we have convening authority, we have knowledge. And then we also have some money. But this is the suite of assets that can be uniquely deployed against this set of problems. And I would say not only is the opportunity large in an absolute sense, but it is particularly large now because the will exists. And we need to seize the opportunity that's represented by that will.
Thank you, Ahmed. I'm going to bring Rick into this conversation because Rick is the chairman of the Climate Disclosure Standard Board. So Rick, you can talk about some of these standard conversations and how the private sector is doing in this space.
Hey, Laura, thanks. And I think Ahmed has really made some very important statements, including where he landed, which is that the will, the aspiration is not lacking. And I made the same point earlier because there's been tons of policy pronouncements about the right policy direction in this respect. And we've seen now, increasing numbers of private sector policy statements like the BRT statement he referred to and World Economic Forums earlier this year. The issue is resources and the enabling institutional architecture at the international level, and to some extent also at the national level in this regard. So that's really a very appropriate place to focus the conversation both here and elsewhere. And on the private sector side, to respond to your question, Laura, part of the problem has been that the international community, the official international community, and the quasi-official accounting authorities internationally have not seen fit to wade into this space. About 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it moved into the financial accounting world and decided that we needed to be able to have a more globally coherent financial reporting system. And IOSCO, the International Organization for Security Commissions, was very important in this respect. So we've seen through the IFRS the evolution of more comparable reporting financially around the world, even though there are still some differences in important geographies. And that has not happened on the sustainability or the ESG side until recently. And I'm happy to report, for those of you who don't follow this as closely as I do, that we're seeing positive movement in both sides, both in the markets, and that is to say the 5 leading ESG reporting standards and frameworks, those organizations, of which I chair one, have been aligning very concretely and issued a joint statement of intent to work together to create a building block, a stepping stone for the ultimate movement by the IFRS or other international accounting authorities to move in this direction. In parallel, IOSCO has been embarking on an internal thought process and consultation process with stakeholders to think about whether it could also provide a catalytic degree of impetus like it did some 15, 20 years ago in the financial reporting space. So I'm pretty optimistic that over the next 18 months or so, we're going to see the birth, building on the market voluntary standards that have been created, of a better metric that can then be a more effective means of stimulating more effective and efficient and sustainable capital allocation. But I do think, and I'll end here, that on the side of infrastructure financing, there's no better suited institutions than multilateral development banks for putting together the necessary degree of risk sharing, risk mitigation, local currency financing, better policy enabling environments in recipient countries. We need a combination of things, and if they work better to get across them, so you get some regional diversification for all their portfolios. I'm talking about the MDBs. We'd have a more effective way of helping economies recover from the pandemic, and at the same time greatly accelerate climate progress toward the Paris Agreement goals. Thus far, we haven't seen that galvanizing leadership from the public sector. It's very difficult for the boards of the institutions, if I can say so, to move themselves individually, let alone collectively. And so I would echo, although I've obviously elaborated and embellished, the basic point that Ahmed made just before I took the floor.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. Let me ask all the panelists, but maybe Ito-san would like to be the first to answer it. How long do you foresee the current global economic recession lasting?
In a sense, if you measure how long it takes to go back to the pre-crisis peak in terms of the GDP or industrial production or other measures, then I would say 2 to 3 years. And that's because of the vaccines are coming, and those COVID treatment will be established, and COVID will become more of a disease that you can live with. So 2 to 3 years is a good estimate, but with an important proviso that again, the new normal will be very different from the old normal. So we have to prepare for the new ways of living and new ways of producing things and new ways of enjoying the life. I firmly believe that we learned something in this pandemic, and we learned something good about this remote conferencing and remote teaching and remote trading. And these remote technologies will not go away. So that's, the recovering to the pre-COVID peak is one thing, but what kind of economy are we reaching is another. Thank you.
You agree, President Jin? 2-3 years?
I think basically I agree with Mr. Ito, but I would say 2021, the global economy will be struggling. 2022, starting to be stabilizing. 2023, picking up.
Okay. Laura?
Okay, I think we're running out of time, unfortunately. So I'd like to thank the panelists. Thank Dino for hosting us, and President Jin for joining us, Rick Sammons, Ahmed Saeed, and Professor Ito-san. Thank you so much. Now we're going to play a video by Mari Elka. Good evening, everyone, and thank you to those who joined us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Please stay safe. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.